Hi there, and welcome to Israel Explained. I'm your host, Ben-Ephraim. So in the last episode, we talked about how ending this war would require some subtlety. And I'm a bit concerned that with our current finance minister in Israel, Bezalel Smotrich, this may not be possible. So a bit of background. I've been supporting this government since the war started. I'm an opponent of Netanyahu's. I think Netanyahu should step down at the end of the war. I thought Netanyahu should step down immediately at the beginning of the war. But I realized that in order to pursue this war successfully, there needs to be stability. Any change of government at this time or change of prime ministership would involve infighting over who would succeed him. That would detract from the war effort. Therefore, I thought early on, Israel needs to stand behind Netanyahu, at least until the end of the conflict. And I think that the results of this war so far speak for themselves. That kind of stability and continuity has been good for the war effort. But I have my concerns about Bezalel Smotrich, and I think that replacing him would be less costly. So let's talk about why. See, in the last episode, we discussed that ending this war would require a certain amount of subtlety, a certain amount of diplomacy that would complement the war effort. War effort's going well, but without a diplomatic solution, without, and I hate this phrase, but it still works, winning the peace, winning the war is kind of pointless, right? So the war has to be ended with subtlety. Now, one of the main problems we have with Gaza, politically, let's move militarily aside right now, is that the jihadist, the ideology of Hamas is absolutely dominant there. So there needs to be some kind of process by which it's removed. And the closest historical parallel is probably denazification in Germany, which is an overused comparison and certainly not a perfect comparison, but it's a useful one. Or what happened in Japan after the war there. And of course, as we know, both of those processes required complete unconditional surrender, which is what the IDF is working towards now, followed by a kind of Marshall Plan. Now, it may sound unrealistic to have a Marshall Plan for Gaza. And on because on some levels it's much harder to do in Gaza because the culture is so different. But on the other hand, Marshall Plan in Europe was much bigger, on a much larger scale. This could be micromanaged. It's a population of only 2 million people. So changing that society would actually be easy. Now, the money that would be required for this kind of change would have to be international, but there's no way Israel wouldn't be a part of that. And if you're going to change society, every element of that, from education um, to civil society to healthcare to all those things, will require money. So money and budgets are absolutely crucial in this regard. And I'm sure you can see where I'm going with this. Smotrich, as the finance minister, is in charge of the purse strings for the state of Israel. And he's used that position in the past to discriminate against the Arab residents of Israel, or has certainly tried to. He held up money that had already been provided by the previous government, by the Lapid Bennett government, for the Arab councils in the country, saying that if he provided it, it would end up in the hands of, quote, criminals and terrorists. The intervention of the government and the protests from Arab society meant that those funds eventually reached their location. But in the most recent budget, there is fewer funds for Arab residents of Israel, which is concerning because they've been quite loyal during this conflict, and even polls show that their identification with Israel has been high. Now, what does this have to do with Gaza? Well, today, Bezalel Smotrich, for his own political reasons, I'm assuming, tweeted that on his watch, not a single shekel is going to enter Gaza. And then he compared the Palestinian Authority to Nazis and so on and so forth. Um, and like we said, any solution will require Israel investing money in Gaza, unless it's just plans to destroy Gaza and leave it destroyed, which, as we all know, is not going to exactly solve the conflict in the long term. And of course, Smotrich is a vocal supporter of settler terrorism. He said that Hawara should be burned to the ground. He was involved in some settler terrorism stuff himself, and was not found guilty because the courts decided they didn't want to use classified material against him. And as we know, settler terrorism is not necessarily the main contributor, but certainly is inflaming the situation in the West Bank and sometimes threatening to open another front there. And certainly, there has been more violence in the West Bank this year under Smotrich and, of course, his friend Ben-Gvir than there has been since the Second Intifada, which is why really I believe that we're in the midst of a third Intifada, with Gaza being the most climactic element of it, but the West Bank is also way more violent than it used to be. Settler terrorism and the support of it is definitely part of that. So for all these reasons, I think Israel can't win the peace with Smotrich in charge of the purse strings. I just don't think that that is viable. Israel will have difficulty holding on to the loyalty of its Arab citizens, will have difficulty keeping the West Bank relatively quiet. It's already not quiet, but and will have difficulty rebuilding Gaza after the war. Now, it may sound politically unfeasible to remove Smotrich, but the truth is, right now, the government is made out of a much wider consensus than it was going into the war, right? With Gantz and the Likud, they don't actually need Smotrich's votes in order to maintain the coalition. His role is actually well above his electoral weight, especially in comparison to Gantz's party. So he could be removed. He is excess baggage politically, and he's incredibly disruptive diplomatically. So this is something that Israel really needs to look into as quickly as possible. Now let's answer some questions that I got after yesterday's video. Great questions, as always. So Abby asks, what do you think is the best way to handle the intergenerational mistrust, hatred, and anti-Semitism among Palestinian communities? I think to really resolve it, it'll need to be more than simply the education system. She adds, I understand it's a problem across the world too, and the sad reality is that ultimately none of this helps. Boy, I really wish I had a good answer for that. But ultimately, I think it has to do with ending this war properly, as everything else comes to that, in my opinion. Back in the Second Intifada, which Israel won handily, by the way, um, Israel wasn't able to offer a vision for a better Palestinian society after conflict. One of the major reasons for that is because the PA was still in charge and Israel didn't remove it. Israel wasn't under full control. And it kind of felt like if it just builds a wall, the problem might go away. Well, the problem did not go away. And the defeat in the military defeat that the Palestinians experienced there kept them quiet or quiet-ish for a very long time. So I said that this was the most violent year since the Second Intifada. Then the Second Intifada ended in 2005. So between 2005 and 2023, there was a lot less violence, but that was because the stick was very strong. Israel won militarily, and Israel's about to do that too. And that'll probably guarantee quiet for a while. But without a vision for a better tomorrow, that's not going to last, right? So by improving the quality of life in Gaza, and building civil society, and improving education, and reforming the PA so that there's less corruption, all those sorts of things, you'll be combining the carrot and the stick to change Palestinian society. What you want is ultimately for Palestinians all around the world to feel that making peace with Israel is better for them than making war with Israel. And that involves both thinking that if they try war again, they will lose, and thinking that their lives under the new regime are better and that there's hope. So, in both those ways, they have something to lose and they're worried about what happens if they go to war again. So, I think the combination of those two things will change reality. Sometimes the diaspora, you mentioned the diaspora, is slower than the people on the ground. Like, for example, in Ireland, when they signed the Good Friday peace agreement, a lot of people in the Irish diaspora were against it because they were more hardcore, but the people in Northern Ireland were sick of fighting. So sometimes the diaspora has to follow the locals, and the West Bank might have to follow Gaza. We need Gaza to be the fulcrum of a change in Palestinian society. And victory militarily gives us the opportunity, a unprecedented opportunity, to do that. So hopefully that answers your question. Ian asks, aren't your plans for the day after in conflict with Bibi's political interests, and an ongoing war, at least until the next election, is politically better for him? Yes. Um, I think that right now Israel's in crisis. Right now, the war is in a make or break moment. Hamas is losing. And if Israel keeps up the pressure, Hamas will collapse. Once that happens, once we're out of the emergency era, it is definitely time to start replacing Netanyahu, because Netanyahu has a political need to keep the emergency going for as long as possible. And it's bad for him politically to create the kind of situation where peace is possible, right? Because that will get the right wing base riled up against him. And the right wing base is what he's based on. So you're absolutely right. Netanyahu can't land this plane successfully. Um, I would, so the moment to stop him, to start thinking about replacing him, is probably when the high intensity in this war ends. So everyone's talking right now about the beginning of January, because the US has said that. And Israel's agreed to that in private discussions, as when this conflict sort of moves to a different phase. And that's when Netanyahu really has to be replaced. I'll talk about that in another video, how that happens. Does that happen? Danielle's going to fight tooth and nail against it, but it has to happen. You're right. There's a contradiction there. And Israelis are very, very aware of that contradiction. Izzy asked, do you really think there's any way Israel could lose the war? Because I've been saying, you know, we need to keep up the pressure in order to win. And Israel's in a very good position right now militarily, but it's so easy for Israel to lose this war. All Israel needs to do to lose this war is take its foot off the gas and have Gaza remain with control. Hamas remain with control of parts of Gaza. If Israel, for example, stop now, maintain the north of the Gaza Strip, and allowed Hamas control of the south, um, that would be a defeat for Israel. After all the effort and prestige they put in order to try to topple Hamas, and all the promises that they made and the leeway they managed to get from the United States, and the ferocity of the crimes that Hamas committed against Israel, that would send a message to the entire region that Israel is a paper tiger, can't defeat its enemies, can't get its act together. And I would say that its time on the face of the earth would be limited. So, yeah, if Israel doesn't win this completely, and that means destroying Hamas's ability to rule Gaza permanently, then Israel will lose the war. So that's why it's absolutely crucial that Israel does not stop at this point. Okay, so that was Israel Explained for today. If you have any questions you want me to answer in the next episode, leave them in the comments here. And every day I'll be releasing these and answering the new questions. See ya.